The sun rose over Palestine on September 3, 1260, casting long shadows across the dusty plains where 20,000 Mongol warriors advanced with the steady confidence of an army that had never truly been stopped. For 4 decades, their empire had expanded like a wildfire no one could contain. China had buckled. Persia had collapsed. Baghdad, once the center of the Islamic world, had been turned into ruins that still smoldered with memory and fear. As these riders thundered toward a modest spring known as Ain Jalut, their bows glinting in the morning light. Mongol commanders believed Cairo, and by extension the entire Middle East, would fall in just a matter of weeks. But high in the hills overlooking the valley, Mamluk commander Baibars watched them with calculated calm. Unlike the countless armies that had panicked at the sight of Mongol banners, Baibars understood something different was unfolding here. He saw not an unstoppable force, but an army about to walk into the deadliest trap of the medieval world. To understand why this obscure valley became the graveyard of Mongol invincibility, you first need to grasp what made these two military systems so dangerously effective. The Mongol war machine was a masterpiece of brutal efficiency. Every warrior was a mounted archer, capable of firing 20 arrows a minute, even while galloping in tight formation. Their units were organized with stunning clarity groups of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 allowing them to scale their armies without losing coordination. Communication was so refined that entire battlefield maneuvers could be executed with nothing more than flags, horns, and messengers riding at breakneck speed. And then there was the terror. The Mongols didn't just conquer with tactics, they conquered with reputation. When scouts appeared on the horizon, cities surrendered before a single arrow was fired. Everyone had heard the stories if you resisted. They would exterminate everything within your walls, men, women, children, even livestock. If you submitted without a fight, you might live long enough to pay tribute. This strategy had propelled them across our continents. In 1258, when they captured Baghdad, the world watched in horror as the caliph, descendant of centuries of Islamic leadership, was executed in a carpet and trampled beneath horses so his blood wouldn't be spilled directly. It wasn't just conquest, it was theater, and the message was unmistakable: Mongol victory was inevitable. But the Mamluks, they were something entirely different. These were not peasants forced into military service or feudal knights fighting for land. They were elite warriors, purchased as children, ripped from the Eurasian steppes or the Caucasus, then molded through one of the most intense military training regimes in human history. From childhood, a Mamluk learned only one thing: war. They practiced archery until they could hit precise targets at full gallop. They drilled swordsmanship until the blade felt like an extension of their own arm. Most importantly, they learned to fight as heavy cavalry, capable of smashing enemy formations in close combat with terrifying force. The Mongol warrior was a flexible generalist, deadly in any environment, whether desert, forest, or mountain. A Mamluk was a specialist, a precision weapon designed specifically to break cavalry through raw skill and discipline. By 1260, the Middle East was on the brink of collapse. Hulagu Khan, one of the most aggressive Mongol leaders, had conquered everything from Iran to Syria. His general Kitbuka had been tasked with completing the job: destroy the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt and cement Mongol dominance across the region. Sultan Qutuz of Egypt knew exactly how dire the situation was. No army had ever beaten the Mongols in a major open battle. They had more troops, better logistics, and decades of psychological momentum. Entire kingdoms had folded with barely a fight. But Qutuz possessed something the Mongols had never encountered: commanders like Baibars who understood their methods intimately. Baibars had studied the Mongol advance through Syria. He observed their preference for open terrain, where their mobility turned battles into effortless victories. He noted their reliance on psychological pressure, how they expected enemies to break, flee, and be hunted down in the open. Most importantly, he recognized the one scenario where Mongol strengths became weaknesses: broken, narrow terrain where formations couldn't operate smoothly and pursuit became chaotic rather than controlled. If Baibars could force the Mongols into such a landscape and convince them to commit fully, he might create the one situation where they could finally be defeated. All that remained was to lure them in. On September 3rd, as the Mongol vanguard overlooking Ain Jalut crested the hills, Kitbuka believed he saw exactly what he expected: a small Mamluk force near the springs, perhaps 3,000 cavalry in a loose formation. To him, this looked like fear. A small, fragile defensive screen trying to protect access to water. Kitbuka smiled. By noon, he assumed this fight would be over. The Mongols advanced confidently. Their formation was textbook heavy cavalry in the center, light archers on the wings, reserves poised to exploit any weakness. This was the same structure that had wiped out armies from China to Hungary. But then, something strange happened. Just as the Mongols moved into firing range, the Mamluks began pulling back, not frantically, but in what looked like a disciplined retreat. Baibars was beginning the performance of his life. Mongol doctrine emphasized relentless pursuit. Their officers were trained from youth to believe that a retreating enemy was a defeated enemy. A fleeing opponent was the easiest to kill, and countless Mongol victories had been won during the chase rather than during the clash. Kitbuka had seen it himself. At Mohi, Hungarian forces had been slaughtered by the thousands during their retreat. At Legnica, Polish knights trying to withdraw were cut down like wheat. To a Mongol commander, retreat equaled collapse. But Baibars executed the illusion with surgical precision. His forces withdrew at exactly the right pace, fast enough to look pressured, slow enough to be tempting. The formations stayed just disciplined enough to seem like they were trying desperately to avoid falling apart. And that was enough. Kitbuka ordered the pursuit. Mongol archers surged ahead, firing volleys at the Mamluk rear guard. A few Mamluks fell, and that sight confirmed everything Kitbuka already believed. This wasn't a trick. This was fear. The chase intensified, stretching the Mongol formation mile by mile across the valley. Their coordination, usually impeccable, began to loosen. Faster units pushed ahead, slower ones lagged behind. The pursuing army grew longer, thinner, more fragmented, and still Baibars retreated just enough to keep the chase alive. Then, 3 miles into the valley, Kitbuka made the decision Baibars had been waiting for. He committed his reserves. Now the entire Mongol force was stretched thin, fully invested in what they believed was the final destruction of a collapsing enemy. They never saw what was coming next. Hidden in the hills on both sides of the valley were 2 massive Mamluk forces, nearly 9,000 cavalry waiting in silence. At Baibars' signal, they burst from concealment, charging down the slopes toward the unsuspecting Mongols. In an instant, the battlefield transformed from a predictable Mongol pursuit into a nightmare of encirclement. One moment, Kitbuka's troops were charging down a clear valley after what they believed was a broken foe. The next, they were caught in a 3-sided storm of Mamluk cavalry, thundering toward them with lances lowered and swords flashing. The psychological shock alone was enough to fracture even the most disciplined army. Mongol troops rarely encountered surprise on the battlefield. They were usually the ones using deception ambushes and feigned retreats. Now the trap had been sprung on them, and the consequences were devastating. The Mongol communication system, so precise in open terrain, collapsed almost immediately. Dust clouds kicked up by thousands of hooves obscured visibility. Horn signals were drowned out by the roar of charging horses and the clash of steel. Units that were supposed to operate in perfect synchronization suddenly found themselves isolated, unable to see commanders or receive orders. Meanwhile, the Mamluks were in their element. For decades, these warriors had trained for exactly this kind of close quarters, a high-intensity cavalry fight. Their armor was heavier than the Mongols, giving them better protection once the battle shifted from long-range archery to brutal melee. Their swordsmanship, refined from childhood, gave them a decisive edge in one-on-one combat, and their horses trained not for long-distance endurance like Mongol ponies, but for explosive power and maneuverability in tight spaces. proved far more effective in the chaos of a compressed battlefield. The Mongol warriors fought fiercely, but without formation. Their famed adaptability became desperation. Arrows were far less effective at point-blank range. Their horses struggled to turn quickly under the pressure of Mamluk assaults. And with enemies closing from multiple sides, their usual tactic of tactical withdrawal or regrouping became impossible. Kitbuka himself, a seasoned commander who had witnessed decades of Mongol victories, realized the trap too late. He tried desperately to rally his forces, attempting to carve a path through the encircling Mamluks, but the situation had already spiraled beyond recovery. Baibars and Sultan Qutuz had crafted the perfect kill zone. As the Mongol center collapsed under the weight of the Mamluk assault, individual pockets of Mongol soldiers were isolated and cut down. Some tried to flee back up the valley, only to run straight into Mamluk units charging downhill. Others attempted to form defensive circles, but these were quickly broken by coordinated Mamluk strikes. In the midst of the chaos, Kitbuka fell pierced by a Mamluk lance. His death was more than symbolic. It marked the moment when Mongol morale shattered completely. The remaining troops, leaderless and surrounded, either fought to the death or attempted hopeless escapes into the hills. Only a fraction survived to carry word of the disaster north. And that word spread faster than any army. For the first time in living memory, a major Mongol force had been annihilated in open battle, not slowed by weather, not delayed by disease, not disrupted by internal politics, but destroyed by a rival army on equal terms. This wasn't just a tactical victory. It was the destruction of an idea, the myth that Mongol conquest was inevitable. News of the defeat rippled across continents. In Europe, kings who had long feared the unstoppable advance of Mongol armies celebrated. Monarchs from Hungary to France had spent years preparing for what seemed like an unavoidable invasion. Now they knew the Mongols could be beaten. In the Islamic world, the impact was even more profound. Cities that had submitted to Mongol rule out of fear found new courage. Damascus, Aleppo, and Homs, all of which had been under Mongol influence, began pushing out their occupiers. Local commanders who had once complied with Hulagu Khan's demands suddenly rose in rebellion. And the Mongols, who had expanded so rapidly that their empire stretched from the Pacific to the Mediterranean, were forced into a difficult reckoning. Hulagu Khan, upon hearing of Kitbuka's destruction, faced a decision that would shape world history. He could attempt to avenge the defeat by sending more armies westward, but doing so would leave the eastern borders vulnerable, especially as rebellions simmered in China. Or he could consolidate what he had already conquered, accepting that the Mongol advance toward Egypt had reached its final boundary. Hulagu chose consolidation, and with that choice, Mongol expansion in the Middle East came to a permanent stop. The empire that had crushed kingdoms and rewritten maps now faced the reality that their momentum had limits. But the true significance of Ain Jalut went beyond politics or geography. For decades, historians, generals, and rulers across the world had attributed Mongol dominance to something almost supernatural. They seemed invincible because their victories were so absolute. But Ain Jalut revealed the truth. Mongol success was not magic. It was the result of specific advantages, mobility communication, psychological warfare that could be neutralized by the right opponent in the right conditions. Baibars had identified those conditions with incredible precision. He understood Mongol doctrine well enough to flip it against them. He exploited their confidence in pursuit. He forced them into a narrow valley where their formations couldn't breathe. And he timed the ambush so perfectly that the Mongols never had a chance to adapt. This wasn't luck, it was mastery. In the decades that followed, the Mongol Empire fractured into rival Khanates, the Golden Horde, the Ilkhanate, the Chagatai Khanate, and the Yuan dynasty in China. Each claimed to be the rightful heir of Genghis Khan's legacy, but none possessed the overwhelming power the unified empire once held. And while these successor states would continue to influence world history, the era of Mongol expansion, the era of unstoppable conquest was over. Its turning point was not a massive siege or a prolonged campaign, but a single morning in a valley where an elite army of former slaves shattered the most feared military force on Earth. In the aftermath of Ain Jalut, Baibars emerged as a hero across the Islamic world. Qutuz, too, became a symbol of defiance, though his reign would be cut short not long after the battle. But it was Baibars who truly understood the magnitude of what had been achieved. He had proven that even the greatest war machine in history could be defeated through intelligence, discipline, and the courage to challenge the impossible. And so the legacy of Ain Jalut lived on, not just as a victory, but as a reminder that no empire is invincible and no power, no matter how terrifying, is beyond challenge when the right strategy meets the right moment. As the dust began to settle in the valley of Ain Jalut, the scale of what had just occurred slowly came into focus. The bodies of Mongol and Mamluk warriors lay scattered across the dry earth. Horses limped or lay still, and the once orderly Mongol banners were trampled beneath hooves and sand. What remained of Kitbuka's great vanguard was not an army, but a scattering of survivors fleeing north with the most shocking news the Mongol Empire had received in generations. They had been defeated decisively, unmistakably, and without excuse. For decades, Mongol setbacks had always come with an explanation. A typhoon had destroyed their fleet during the attempted invasion of Japan. The death of a great Khan had forced armies to retreat from Europe. Bad terrain or supply disruptions might slow their advance. But nothing suggested that another military power could stand toe-to-toe with the empire of Genghis Khan and win. Ain Jalut changed that forever. Here, conditions were ideal. The weather was clear. The troops were experienced. Supplies were sufficient. Command structures were intact. There was no natural disaster, no political interruption, no logistical failure to blame. The Mongols had simply been outfought by an opponent who understood them better than anyone else ever had. And the world took notice immediately. In Damascus, where Mongol garrisons had operated with unquestioned authority, fear turned into defiance almost overnight. Local leaders who had accepted Mongol rule now saw a chance to push back. In Aleppo, citizens who had once trembled at the sight of Mongol riders began driving out their occupiers. Across Syria, rebellion flickered like sparks catching dry grass. Even far beyond the Middle East, the psychological impact reverberated. In Europe, kings who had spent years fortifying cities and praying their lands would be spared from Mongol invasion celebrated the news. The unstoppable force had finally been stopped, not by weather, not by luck, but by strategy. The Mongol Empire, however, now faced an even deeper crisis. Hulagu Khan, ruling from his base in Iran, had ambitious plans to extend Mongol control all the way into Egypt and North Africa. The destruction of Kitbuka's army shattered that vision. Hulagu could theoretically send another massive force westward, but doing so would expose his empire's eastern frontier. Rebellions were already simmering in the newly conquered Chinese territories, and rival Mongol factions were vying for influence. If Hulagu committed everything to avenge this defeat, he risked losing the east. If he focused on defending his core territory, he would have to accept that expansion toward Egypt had reached an abrupt, humiliating end. Hulagu chose the latter. And with that decision, the Mongol advance that had swept from the Pacific Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea came to a standstill. Never again would the Mongol Empire push farther into the Arab world. The turning point of an entire era had occurred in a single day. Yet the full legacy of Ain Jalut was only beginning to unfold. The Mongol Empire, once unified under the thunderous leadership of Genghis Khan, began to fracture. Rival Khanates, the Golden Horde in the northwest, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China competed for dominance. Though each claimed legitimacy, none possessed the unstoppable momentum that had once fueled Mongol conquest. The world no longer saw the Mongols as invincible. That psychological edge, once worth more than numbers or weapons, evaporated entirely. But perhaps the most important legacy resided in the Mamluks themselves. Their victory at Ain Jalut became a defining moment, not just in military history, but in the identity of an entire civilization. For the first time, the Islamic world had not merely survived the Mongol storm, it had defeated it. In the years following the battle, the Mamluk Sultanate emerged as a dominant force in the region. Under Baibars, who would soon become sultan after the assassination of Qutuz, the Mamluks solidified. Their power repelled further Mongol incursions and even expanded northward. Baibars' rule marked the beginning of a Mamluk golden age, one built on the credibility and confidence earned at Ain Jalut. Baibars himself understood the symbolic weight of what had happened. He had not just won a battle, he had shattered a myth. By using deception, terrain, and psychological insight, he turned the Mongols' own playbook against them. He recognized their addiction to the pursuit of fleeing enemies, their reliance on open terrain, and their belief that their opponents would always crumble under pressure. Baibars dismantled those assumptions with a single masterstroke of strategy. The Mamluk army, forged out of enslaved children trained into elite warriors, had proven that discipline and man-to-man skill could triumph over an empire that had conquered half the world. For historians, Ain Jalut stands as one of the most consequential battles of the medieval period. It did not just protect Egypt from invasion, it preserved the cultural and political continuity of the Islamic world. Had the Mongols succeeded, the Middle East might have undergone the same catastrophic transformation that befell Baghdad. But by stopping the Mongols here, the Mamluks ensured that the region's intellectual, religious, and political institutions could recover and evolve. This victory indirectly paved the way for future powers, as including the Ottoman Empire, to rise in the centuries that followed. And yet, perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Ain Jalut, how close it came to being just another Mongol victory. Had Baibars mistimed his retreat by even a few minutes, had the hidden Mamluk forces been spotted too early, had Kitbuka hesitated instead of fully committing to the pursuit, the outcome could have been drastically different. Instead, everything aligned. The terrain, the timing, the psychology, the execution. The Mamluks turned the Mongols' greatest strength, their overwhelming confidence, into their fatal flaw. And that is why Ain Jalut is remembered not simply as a battle, but as a turning point in world history. The Mongol Empire would continue to exist for decades, but never again would it possess the aura of invincibility that had terrified nations from Korea to Hungary. In a single morning in a quiet valley, the momentum of global history shifted. A force that had seemed destined to conquer the world was finally stopped by a commander who understood that even the mightiest armies have weaknesses. All it takes is the right trap at the right moment, executed with absolute precision. And if you want to see how the aftermath of this victory set the stage for the rise of the Ottomans and reshaped the political landscape of the entire region, you'll definitely want to watch the next video. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss more deep dives into the battles and strategies that changed the course of history.